Welcome to the Lydia McGrew YouTube channel. This video is scheduled to be released on Palm Sunday. So I will begin by wishing you a blessed Palm Sunday. I looked back through my videos on this YouTube channel and I realized that it doesn't look like I've ever done a video on the claim that John moved the day of Jesus' crucifixion. So I said, well, that would fit pretty well for Palm Sunday to talk about that claim that John moved the day. Now I want to make it clear that the claim I'm rebutting, because I'm saying John did not move the day, is the claim that he moved the day of the month, not so much that he moved the day of the week. So to define this, the claim is that there's a contradiction between the Gospel of John and the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, and Luke. They portray Jesus' crucifixion as taking place on the day after the Passover lambs were slain, and then supposedly John portrays Jesus as being crucified on the days when the Passover lambs were slain. So that's the claim of contradiction. So it would be different days in the Jewish month. I want to just say here, kind of a spoiler, I'm not going to go with any of the solutions that are out there that claim that there were multiple different days on which you could kill the Passover lambs and celebrate Passover, and Jesus used a different one or something like that. Matthew, Mark, and Luke all refer quite unequivocally to a day when the Passover lambs were slain as a socially generally accepted day, that there was a day, not multiple different days. And so they portray the Last Supper as taking place on that day. I think the Last Supper did take place on that day, and I think that John is completely compatible with the Synoptic Gospels on that point. The critical claim that I'm rebutting is that John moved it to the day after the lambs were slain, John moved it to the day when the lambs were slain, Jesus' crucifixion, in order to symbolize more strongly than the Synoptics his being the Passover lamb. Now, there are a lot of things that can be said about this, and I'm going to be trying to spend most of my time talking about the three proof texts that are used by those who say that John moved the day. But I want to just make a few preliminary remarks. It's very clear that in 1 Corinthians, Paul is quite aware of what we might call the Synoptic tradition, the Lucan tradition, of the institution of the Last Supper. In fact, his wording is very similar to Luke's. He may even have had access to an early draft, as it were, of Luke's gospel, or maybe even to the whole thing. So Paul knows, some kind of synoptic passion tradition. And yet the Apostle Paul says, Christ our Passover is sacrificed for us, therefore let us keep the feast. So in other words, Paul doesn't think there's any problem with Jesus being the Passover lamb. I would say, even though he must recognize, if he has access to that synoptic tradition, that in that tradition Jesus is not sacrificed on the very day when the Passover lambs are sacrificed, that he dies the next day, still within that week of the Feast of Unleavened Bread. And I would say that makes sense too, that there's no reason that for the symbolism Jesus has to be sacrificed, right on the very day when the Passover lambs die, as long as he dies in the time of that Passover feast. And I would say arguably this is what Paul thinks as well. Another point that I'll probably bring up again is that John doesn't actually have nearly as strong of a theme of Jesus as specifically the Passover lamb as scholars will portray. Even the mention by John the Baptist, the Lamb of God who takes away the sins of the world, doesn't say Passover lamb. It's kind of interesting. He may be thinking of the Passover lamb, but there were lambs that took away sins, like on the feast of the Day of the Atonement. Not a feast, but on the Day of Atonement. So it's not really clear that John has this super strong idea. Now, there may be an indirect reference when John says that the scripture was fulfilled, not a bone of him shall be broken, that might be referring to the Passover lamb, but it might also be referring to a psalm. But it's not like John has this super strong tradition. In fact, in Jesus' passion, he never explicitly mentions Passover lambs at all. Kind of interesting. And we shouldn't bring in Revelation because that hadn't even, John's readers probably wouldn't have even had access to that. Okay? Wouldn't have been written yet, probably. Where he talks about the lamb that was slain and so forth. So that theme is not nearly as clear there. In fact, it's the Synoptics that mention the Passover lambs being slain, not John. They say that the Last Supper took place on the evening of the day when the Passover lambs were slain. So you could almost say they have a stronger Passover lamb tradition than John does. I know, I'm shattering all the categories here, but I think it's good to question these kinds of unquestioned theories sometimes about a given author's themes. Okay, what I want to do now is I want to go to the 3 proof texts for the claim that John changed the day of the crucifixion, and therefore also the day of the Last Supper. Now, I'm following here pretty closely the work of Craig Blomberg, and I don't know of any place where on this issue I even disagree with Blomberg. I mean, I think he does a very good job, and I'll be reading a quotation or two from him. But he's not the only credentialed scholar who takes this position. I believe D.A. Carson and Andreas Kostenberger do as well, and I know for sure the Catholic scholar Brant Pitre does as well. And he's brought a lot of his own research to bear here. He's not just, copying Blomberg, but he agrees with him quite explicitly. So if you're interested in, credentialed scholars and what they think, certainly the mainstream scholars, and unfortunately some evangelical scholars as well, think that John moved the day, but it's not like, it's just uncredentialed Lydia against all the credentialed scholars. That's not correct. And let me also make clear, the moving here is what I've called, in the theory, is what I've called dyschronological moving. The idea being that John is trying to narrate as if these things happened on a different day than the day when he knew they really happened. Let's get that really clear, that this isn't just his narrating out of order or something, but it's his actually trying to make it look like it happened on a day when it didn't really happen. And I'm responding to that theory. So I want to start with the first proof text. I'm going to be reading from the 1970s NASB version here. The first proof text used for this is a really poor one. Even this text is not best interpreted that way. It's John 13, 1 and 2. And by stopping at 2, I'll be ending in the middle of a sentence. You're welcome to open your Bible, read the rest of that sentence. And John 13, 1, however, is a complete sentence, and in the Greek as well. All right. Now, before the feast of the Passover, Jesus, knowing that his hour had come, that he should depart out of this world to the Father, having loved his own who were in the world, having loved his own who were in the world, he loved them to the end. That's verse 1. And during supper, the devil having already put into the heart of Judas Iscariot, the son of Simon, to betray him, and goes on and describes the foot washing. Jesus rose from supper and so forth. All right. Now, what will be claimed is that these verses say that this Last Supper Jesus had with his disciples was eaten before the feast of the Passover. If you read carefully, that is not what it says. Before the feast of the Passover, it says he loved them. So before the feast of the Passover, he loved his own who were in the world. Then it says during supper, or supper being served, that he rose and washed their feet. Now that's really important, because actually I would argue that it is a better interpretation there that supper refers to the Passover. And this is a point that I'm taking from Craig Blomberg, but I strongly agree with it, that since it's just talked about Jesus loving his own before the feast of the Passover and the lead up to the feast of the Passover, and then when it starts during supper, The supper that is most nearly in view is the Passover. So there's an excellent quote here I'm going to actually read from Blomberg. This is from an article in an anthology called Do Historical Matters Matter to Faith? It's kind of a response to Kenton Sparks from some years ago. Sparks very strongly takes this view that John moved the crucifixion. I don't agree with everything on other topics that Blomberg says in this article, but on this issue of the crucifixion day, I strongly agree with him. Okay. Imagine, he says, if I were to write about a comparable treasured annual American festival, Thanksgiving, that for many people leads to a 4-day weekend of festive eating, but with Thursday dinner being the most significant meal that kicks off the celebration. Quote, now before the Thanksgiving feast, my grandmother, knowing that her days were numbered, decided to go all out for her family and shower her love on us. Then imagine that after a pause, my narrative continued when dinner time came. Without reference to any other meals anywhere in the context, would any American reader think of any dinner other than the eagerly expected Thanksgiving dinner? Okay, so I think that's excellent. And so I would argue this is actually, in a sense, better interpreted. This is not just like a harmonization of John with the Synoptics. This is better interpreted as referring to that meal as a Passover meal, not as occurring the previous day and then Jesus dying on the day when the Passover lambs were killed. Another point that I think is very well taken that Blomberg makes is that throughout the chapters that follow, 13 through 17, John is repeatedly making statements about what happened on that night that make it so clear that he's talking about the same meal that the synoptic authors place so firmly on the day when the Passover lambs were killed, the meal taking place on the day when the Passover lambs are killed, and then, Jesus is being dragged around all night and he's crucified the next day, okay, in the Synoptics. Now, if John's readers or hearers are just listening to the Passion narrative, and starting from verse 13 and going on, they're going to read these things like Jesus predicting his death, and Jesus predicting that one of them will betray him, and the disciples being upset by that, and Judas Iscariot betrays him on that night, and all these things in the Passion. And if they already know the synoptic narrative, they're going to connect it with the synoptic narrative. So it would be very confusing for John to be moving this to like a different night, like moving it back one night, when what he's saying makes it so clear that it's that same meal. Now, someone might say, well, yeah, he's moving the synoptic meal. But the point is that if you're just listening to the narration of the Last Supper in John, there are so many things that connect it with the Last Supper in the Synoptics that it's going to be a very natural assumption that they actually are in agreement. Okay, so, and especially when we see how poor this proof text 13:1 and 2 is, we actually have an unequivocal narration of the Last Supper on John's part that fits perfectly with the Synoptics. Okay, so next proof text. Got to go way forward to John 18:28. This is when the religious leaders are taking Jesus to Pilate. They led Jesus, therefore, from Caiaphas into the praetorium, and it was early, and they themselves did not enter into the praetorium, in order that they might not be defiled, but might eat the Passover. Okay, now, the critics will say, okay, see? They didn't want to be defiled so that they could eat the Passover. That means the Passover meal, that first meal of Passover week, hadn't happened yet. So John is placing Jesus' crucifixion on the day when, that evening, the Passover meal is going to take place. So it's not that it took place the next day, as in the Synoptics, but that it took place on the day when the Passover lambs were killed, and this is hinted by their scruple that they might eat the Passover. So here I want to refer to my video I did a couple weeks ago called Breaking It Down. Remember that in that video, we tried to think about the burden of proof of these highly complex theories of subtle changes by the gospel authors. So let's just see kind of how this breaks down. Okay. John knew that Jesus was crucified on the day after the Passover lambs were slain, in reality. I actually agree with that, but I don't think he disagrees with the Synoptics on that either. All right. Next, John didn't think that symbolized the Passover well enough. Unlike Paul, who seems to think that's fine. Okay, we're psychoanalyzing John now. John therefore decided to dischronologically move the Passover, or Jesus' crucifixion in relation to the Passover. So he's crucified on the day when when the Passover lambs were slain instead of the day after. And he doesn't indicate this in any explicit way. Once again, there is no mention of the Passover lambs being slain. No explicit mention of that in John's Passion narrative. Instead, keep going with this, breaking it down, John invented a scruple on the part of the religious leaders, which in reality they didn't really feel. He had to have invented it, if their interpretation is correct here, that is the evening Passover meal, because according to the theory, in reality, that had already happened, and so they didn't really feel this scruple. So John invented it, and in this highly indirect way, he expected his hearers and readers to infer from this that he had moved the day of Jesus' crucifixion, and to gain from this the theological help of thinking even more strongly of Jesus as the Passover lamb. That's bizarre. A sizable proportion of John's readership, maybe even most of them, would have been Gentiles. Whether John was written before or after the destruction of Jerusalem, but especially if after, they wouldn't have been thinking about Jewish ritual and purity laws. And this is the same John who pauses to translate Aramaic phrases, etc., and explains things sometimes pretty clearly for a Gentile audience. But here somehow he just does it in this super indirect way to indicate super subtly, that he's moving it. Very, very improbable theory. Does not compute, does not make sense. Well, okay, then the question is, what does it mean that they didn't want to be defiled so that they could eat the Passover? Well, as a number of scholars have pointed out, the term, the Passover, was used in other literature, in Jewish rabbinic literature. I believe it's used in Josephus to refer to the entire week. It's like the Passover week, okay? The entire feast of unleavened bread, it's like a week long. So if that entire feast week can be the Passover, then we also know that there were lesser meals within it, not just that first night, known as the Hagigah, sometimes eaten during the day, not just in the evening. In fact, one of them would have been at lunchtime on that day. That then could plausibly also be referred to as the Passover, or eating the Passover. There's another really important historical point here. Arguably, the kind of defilement that they would have gotten, ritual defilement, by going into Pilate's hall, could have been removed by washing at sundown. So it wouldn't, if this were the evening meal that eat the Passover refers to, it wouldn't have prevented them from it. Whereas if it's a daytime meal, the Hagigah, then that defilement would have prevented them from eating it because sundown would not yet have come. So arguably, the interpretation that this is referring to a different meal in Passover week as eating the Passover is a better interpretation of the verse, even on the face of it, on the historical and linguistic background. Now, that's really important to know, and it's something a lot of people don't hear. All right, that's that. Now we come to what is considered to be the strongest Proof text, John 19:14. So Pilate is sitting down in his seat of judgment, and he's about to deliver Jesus to be crucified. Now it was the day of preparation. NASB has for the Passover. I'm going to argue better translation is day of preparation of the Passover. It was about the 6th hour, and he said to the Jews, "Behold your king." Now there's the reference here to the 6th hour, and I just want to say right now, I'm not going to discuss the time of the crucifixion. There's also a claim that John changed the time of the crucifixion, like the hour of the day, and that this 6th hour is that change. This video is already going to be long enough with the discussion of the claim that John moved the day of the crucifixion, so I'm not going to discuss the claim that John also moved the time of the crucifixion. Maybe I'll do another video on that at a later time, but I'll just say a couple of words about that. Brant Pitre, I think, has argued really well on that this wouldn't even be a good way to say that Jesus was killed at the very time that the Passover lambs were killed. This kind of hyper subtle reference here for several reasons. For one thing, there wasn't just a time, talking a lot of lambs here, so it took time. For another thing, this is the time when Pilate condemns Jesus to death. This isn't the time when Jesus actually is crucified or dies. There's events in between there, and then the time when he hangs on the cross. John doesn't even say how long he hung on the cross, so that wouldn't really match well. And then also, again, it would be very implausible to expect John's Gentile readers to know, the time when the Passover lambs were slain. So this would not be a good way of doing that. Anyway, that's all I'll say about the time. But what about this, the day of preparation for or of the Passover? So that article there, it's just a genitive article of the, it's a very good translation of it. And the word preparation, okay, is the word paraskue in Greek. Now, if you read this in isolation, and especially with the translation preparation for, you go, well, see there, John is saying outright that Jesus was condemned on the day of the preparation for the Passover. And so he must have died on that day when the lambs were killed, not on the following day, which contradicts the Synoptics. That word preparation, however, is used even by John in two other verses in this very chapter, verse 31 and verse 42, in the much more common way, and also in the way that Mark uses it in the context of the crucifixion to just mean Friday, the preparation for the Sabbath. In fact, even Blomberg points out in Greek, paraskue means Friday, probably from that influence there from the Jewish calendar and so forth. This came, every week they had a Sabbath, and the day of the preparation for the Sabbath was was Friday, okay? We don't have attested anywhere else the use of this Greek phrase to mean the day that's preparing for the Passover, the first day of Passover. We don't have anywhere where the, paraskue to Pascha is being used in the way that the critics want to interpret that phrase here. So if it's just the paraskue, the Friday of Passover, then it's a very natural interpretation to take it to mean the Friday within that week-long celebration of Passover. Sort of like maybe we would refer to Memorial Day weekend. Okay, Memorial Day is on a Monday, but the whole weekend is referred to as Memorial Day weekend. So you could have a Saturday and Memorial Day weekend, for example. Or like Christmas is a 12-day feast if you're Anglican. And so, you got the 12 days of Christmas, right? So you could have the Sunday after that would be, the Sunday in Christmas, Sunday in the Feast of Christmas. Okay, so that's actually a very natural interpretation there. So this is probably considered to be the biggest gotcha one, but it's actually not some kind of, required interpretation that this is meaning the preparation for the first day of the Passover. And it's at least equally natural to take paraskue to be used unequivocally by John, to be used by John in the same way throughout the chapter. Again, this is, interpreting John with John, not just trying to harmonize John with the Synoptics. So there I've dealt with the three big acclaimed gotcha verses. And you'll hear skeptics and Christians alike sometimes just stating very matter-of-factly, John changed the day of the crucifixion. Sometimes they don't even know why this is believed. They just know that it is widely believed, and then they just take it as a given. Well, we all know that, and you say, really? No, we really don't. Well, then why do people say it? Oh, interesting. You think this, but you don't know why people say that. I mean, I've actually heard of conversations where that's happened. But I think since it is so widely believed, including among scholars who do know why they say it, it's good to go over that for ourselves and to go over the alleged proof texts and to see that they're just not clear at all. In fact, arguably, especially John 13, 1 and 2, and John 18:28 are better interpreted to be consonant with both John's other indications of when the Last Supper took place and what it was, and that he agrees with the Synoptics, and to fit with the Synoptics. So we really don't have some kind of overwhelming case for this extremely hyper-subtle theory. I'm thinking about what I'm going to do next week for Easter. I may read a passage on the appearance to Mary Magdalene from a draft of my forthcoming book, Testimonies to the Truth. That's something I'm considering. Maybe I'll do something different. But until then, I'm going to wish you who are Christians a blessed Holy Week. Thanks for watching. Please be sure to like and subscribe to the Lydia McGrew YouTube channel, where we're making common sense rigorous.